Okay, we've got chapter 2 titled The Men in Blue. Charley Skedaddle, written by Patricia Beatty. 20 minutes later, dressed in the plug hat, black jacket, red flannel shirt, high-heeled boots, and broadcloth trousers that were the uniform of the Bowery boys, Charley hurried down the wet, gaslit street to find his gang. Would they still be at the shooting galleries? Probably not. Bowery boys never stayed long in one place. There was always plenty to do in the Bowery. Charley walked boldly, not afraid of any metropolitans he might meet. The clothes he wore and the knife in his pocket gave him courage. He'd have preferred to carry Johnson's fancy knife with the staghorn handle, but that had gone to Gettysburg with him and not come home to him and Noreen. His silver watch had, though, and Charley always had it with him. The Bowery boys were not at the shooting galleries, and no one he asked seemed to know where they had gone. His head high, proud of the black eye and torn cheek that showed he had not run away from a scrap, Charley moved jauntily as a Bowery boy should, darting in and out of the loud and flashily dressed city crowds that came to this part of New York for a good time. This is where he belonged. This was his part of the city. Sitting in the flat with Noreen, he sometimes felt he couldn't catch his breath. But here in the Bowery, he could. He had 50 cents in his pocket. Where should he go? He wished it was already April and the Metropolitan Fair had opened. It would do the city proud. Noreen had read about the exhibits to him from the Times. He wanted to see the Indian tents and the captured battle flags for the Mexican War and the hairy eagle that the governor of Illinois' wife had made from the hair of the heads of President Lincoln and his cabinet officers and senators. By April, he hoped to have a whole extra silver dollar to put into the box that would be under the eagle. The money was to be used for the sanitary commission that ran army hospitals to help Union soldiers wounded in battles. If he gave $1, he would also be able to sign the album that would be going to Abraham Lincoln along with the hairy eagle after the fair closed. Abe could read his name, Charles Stephen Quinn, along with all the other signers, or he could hardly wait for the fair. He'd be there the first day for sure. But that was for April. What should he do right now? Should he go to Barnum's museum and look at the giants and the tiny people like General Tom Thumb and his even tinier wife? Should he see the huge snake Barnum had there, or the creature that was called the What Is It? Where he decided to go? It wouldn't be to Niblo's Theater with his sister and Mr. Demarest were. Standing in front of a cloak shop in Chatham Square, Charley turned up his coat collar against the now heavy rain and scanned the street for Bowery boys and dead rabbits. No one was about in this downpour. As a tall black carriage came down the street, slowing when it neared him, Charley fastened his gaze on it. It was a fine carriage, drawn by a dapple gray horse and driven by a coachman in a high silk hat and dark green coat. A gentleman's carriage for sure. Running from his shelter, Charley kept pace with the carriage along the street. When it stopped in front of a restaurant, Charley dashed forward to pull down the carriage's folded stop for the passengers to step down on. Sometimes swells, fancy gents, paid a whole 10 cents to a boy who did that. A gent in a beaver hat and black coat came down first. He looked at Charley, fumbled in his watch pocket, and brought out a coin, which he tossed to him. Charley caught it in the air and then took down the rain-wet step. After he stepped down, the man lifted out a giggling girl and a black velvet cloak that covered a magenta satin skirt. In her yellow hair was a wreath of red roses and green ivy leaves. As she passed, Charley sniffed her sweet, flowery perfume. Her escort led her to the walk, and with his gold-topped cane pushed away a drunken man who had lurched into them that went on cursing. Charley grinned as he looked at the two of them. 10 cents as he had hoped. He moved back into the entrance of a saloon, listening to the high, reedy voice of a woman singing, "Fairest Rose of Summer." He could scarcely hear her over the din of splashing water, horses' hooves, screeching carriage wheels, and the shouts of drunken men. Oh, it was bound to be a fine Saturday night, and he could make money if he stayed right here and waited for his gang. There would be other carriages and more rich men, with pretty ladies who laughed a lot at everything the escorts said. Some Bowery dance halls and new orchestras and some saloons now had singers and dancers who would attract plenty of pleasure seekers. Charley knew all about the new attractions. He had seen some of them himself and had read about others in the New York Times. Suddenly Charley heard music. Not the fiddle and pianoforte kind that came from the dance houses, but the bright sound of a brass band. A night parade, maybe a military parade. New York had them all the time these days, and Charley loved them. He looked up and down the street and saw nothing, so he hurried toward Broadway, pushing past drunken men, going in and out of saloons. Yes, there it was. Stepping lively were lines of musket-carrying marching men led by a brass band. Out of respect, carriages and carts moved to the curbs and streetcars stopped to permit passage over their rails. Yankee soldiers, men in the Union blue with haversacks, knapsacks, and bedrolls going off to fight for Abe Lincoln against slavery. By Jiminy, weren't they grand and glorious, though? Charley caught his breath, thrilled to see the green silken flag borne by the color bearer, the 140th New York Volunteers, Johnny's regiment. Tears stung Charley's eyes. He was wiping them away when he heard his name called out in a high voice. "Hey, Charley Quinn! Hey, Charley!" He had heard that voice somewhere before. Was it a Bowery boy? No. Charley looked swiftly around him, but saw none of his gang. Did it come from the other watchers there? No. There it was again. "Hey, Charley Quinn!" It came from the marching soldiers. Charley's eyes swept their ranks. After a moment, he spotted the man who had hailed him. He was a tall lamppost of a soldier who, with lank, fair hair. Could it be? Yes, it was. Con Sullivan. He had been one of Johnny's newly made friends and had brought the bad news of Johnny's death along with the silver watch back to him and Noreen after the Battle of Gettysburg, because he'd been wounded there. Con had left the army and had gone back to work on Long Island, his home. He'd never been a Bowery boy, but then you have to live in the Bowery to be that lucky. "Con! Hey, Con!" Leaping from where he stood, Charley splashed down into the marchers, waving his hat, half running beside the soldiers to keep up with their pace. Charley called out, "Why are you back in the army, Con?" "To see the end of the scrapping. We've got the old Johnny Rebs on the run," shouted the man. "When Abe Lincoln put out a call for more men, I came back to my old regiment. I'm well enough now to fight some more. I hope to see ye and say hello as I went by." The man reached out a long arm, pulled Charley to his side, and half carried him along. The pungent, sour smell of whiskey clung to the Irishman, but Charley didn't care. Living in the Bowery, he soon got used to this odor, and Johnny had lifted a glass or two with his friends many a time. So what if Con was a little drunk now? "I see you've been fighting," Con observed. "Think you're old enough to shoulder a musket, Charley, my lad?" How like his brother Con Sullivan was. He made Charley feel 9 feet tall walking along beside him. Charley boasted, "I won the fight. I'm a Bowery boy now, like Johnny was. Sure, I can carry a musket. I go to shooting galleries the way he used to. I shoot good. I can hit things a lot smaller than a Johnny Reb. Where's the 140th going now, Con?" "I don't know. We're in reinforcements right now, and we're all going to wherever the rest of the old regiment is. We're headed to the ships." Con let go of Charley's arm, but the boy grabbed it again, hung on, and was dragged along. "Oh, Con, take me with you. Noreen's getting hitched up with somebody I don't like. They're going to leave the Bowery for someplace else. And," Charley took a deep breath, "throw me in an orphan's home." Well, it hadn't been too much of a lie. Con's mouth opened in amazement as Charley tightened his grip on him. What a thing to do! Such sisterly wickedness! Glancing away from Con, Charley spied some of his Bowery boys a distance ahead of the marchers up the street. They would see him marching along with the men in blue. He knew they'd be impressed that a soldier seemed so fond of him. Most of them vowed that as soon as they were old enough, they'd enlist like Johnny Quinn had. Take me along with you, Con, please? For a moment, the man's face twisted with thought. Then he boomed, Sure, Charley, why not? I got 5 days' cooked rations with me. You can share 'em. A short man with brown sideburns and a dark face in the ranks next to Con said, He's only a shirt-tail kid, Con. No matter, Jim Miller. The Army's got uses for kids. You keep up with us men, Charley, you hear? You let go of me now. I'll keep up, you bet. As Charley trotted past the Bowery boys, he waved his hat and shouted, I'm off to join the Army. At first they looked surprised, and then he heard their cheering, and that warmed his heart. It was the only cheering that was going on. Except for youths like Charley, New York City was weary of the war. After 2 long years of it, weary of the hated draft, of the violent riots protesting it. After what seemed like a very long march to short-legged Charley Quinn, the troops arrived at the Battery and turned onto a street that brought them to a dock and a waiting ocean steamer. Here on the wharf, the soldiers broke ranks and waited until told to form pairs to board. Con hurriedly slipped off his equipment, greatcoat, and the blue jacket beneath it. Flinging his open jacket over Charley, he told him, Hunker down so he won't be spotted. Turning to a grinning, heavy-set soldier near him, he then said, Put your coat over the lad, too, so's we hide him. Sure, Sullivan. Crouching down between the 2 soldiers, Charley marched down the dock, over the gangplank, and onto the deck with no officer spying him. From the deck of the steamer, the 3 men went down narrow steps to between decks. The visibility here was very poor, and the seaweed-scented air was difficult to breathe. 3 hatches were open above the men to let in the night air. Peering through the lantern-lit gloom, Charley noticed that there were no chairs or benches or bunks down here. At once, Con's whiskey bottle came out of his pocket, and he took a long swallow, crying, Here's to new glory for the 140th! New York, and the little recruit we just got for it. Here's to the memory of young Colonel Pat O'Rourke and Johnny Quinn, who fell at Gettysburg. The boy you see with me is Johnny's brother. Traveling with us won't cost him a red cent. We're all guests of Abe Lincoln, and here's to him, too. And Con took a second swallow. As the rest of the marchers came down, Charley Quinn seated himself on the wooden deck next to Con. He promised himself he would write to Noreen and tell her everything once he got to wherever he was going with Johnny's old regiment. She'd have a load off her hands with him gone. Even though he'd helped her out plenty, now that she was marrying Damaris, she didn't need him anymore. Now the boy noticed that the soldier who had said Charley was only a shirt-tail kid sat on the deck across from him. He was the sour one Con had called Jem. Jem shook his head at Charley and looked down at his heavy shoes as if his feet hurt from marching. As he peered around him, Charley's heart grew lighter. This was a real ship. He'd never been on a big ocean-going vessel before. Born on Manhattan Island, he'd never left it except for a picnic ferry boat excursion on a paddle wheel steamer that he, some of his classmates, and a few priests from his school had gone on 3 years ago. All he had ever known was New York City, the coal smoke, the horsey smell that hung in its air, the many noises of traffic and thousands of people. He knew the shops and above all the lively, delightfully wicked Bowery. And where was he going now? Con Sullivan nudged him, gave him a wink, then said, Not to worry, Charley, you're with me. I won't let no Johnny Reb get ye. A Confederate. A Johnny Reb. Charley nodded. It was one of those gray-coated devils who had marched up to Pennsylvania from the south and killed his brother. Charley nodded again. He had a score to settle with the Rebs, a personal one. He told Sullivan proudly, You won't have to protect me from any Rebs. The man reached out and gave Charley a gentle punch on the shoulder. A fire eater, ain't ya? I began so busy training these men on Hard Island that I never once seen a newspaper from New York City. How's the talk going? About digging them tunnels for a railroad so there won't be so much crowding on the street. Do you think they'll dig 'em, Charley? The boy shrugged. He'd been hearing about the idea all year. He said, maybe the streets on top of 'em would fall in. I wouldn't want to be on Broadway if that happens. He changed the subject. I bet we're going way down south on this ship. Maybe so, Colin said non-committally. Soon the between-decks area was crowded with soldiers, all of whom seemed to bring out pipes and cigars and light them. The air had been bad enough, but soon it grew so thick that it was hard to see anyone distinctly unless he was close. More hidden whiskey came out now from deep pockets. Men grew drunk enough to dance, sing, and to fight one another. Charley moved closer to Con, who was half asleep by now because he'd had so much whiskey. Guards came down between decks to break up the fights. They beat the fighting men with clubbed rifles, then drove them up the gangway. Jem came over to Charley. He grabbed him by the collar and dragged him away from Con to the very end of the deck, where the two of them sat together with their backs to the bulkhead. From there, Charley watched drunken soldiers try to climb up the gangway to the upper deck or crawl up through the open hatches. But they were all shoved back by watchful guards who stepped on their hands. It was worse than anything Charley had ever seen in the Bowery. Jem spoke to him in a low growl. Scum of the earth, some of them are. Most of them only joined up for the bounty money. Your friend Kong got a chunk of cash. That's why he joined up. Astonished, Charley asked, not to fight and see the end of the war? Jim laughed for the first time. No, it was for the money. He's no better and no worse than hundreds of others here. But he didn't tell the truth. Again Jim laughed. Stay here with me, son. The wild brutes will fall asleep soon with all the whiskey they've been swilling. They'll be too sick tomorrow to fight. They'll be safer to be around then. Charley asked, why is it you don't fight? I fight, but I don't drink. I got wounded at Fredericksburg last year. I only joined again to help end this war. It's time for it to end. I'm a printer by trade. I was in another regiment at Fredericksburg. It doesn't matter to me where I fight, so long as I fight the rebels and get this over with. I got no bounty money. I volunteered. Charley nodded with pride. So did my brother, Johnny. He got killed at Gettysburg, at Round Top. Those were different days, said Jem, as he stood up to shove away a lurching drunk intent on hitting him and starting a fight. Late that night, the steamer left port with 400 men, 2/3 of them dead drunk, below her decks. The next day was calm, so calm that few got seasick, and with the whiskey gone, the gambling began. Sitting beside Jem, who seemed to have adopted him now that Con had apparently deserted him, Charley looked on as dicing and chuck-luck games played on a cloth took over the huge deck. Living in the Bowery, Charley had seen gambling before, but never anything like this. Soldiers gambled like madmen, losing their bounty pay to professional gamblers who had come aboard in New York disguised as soldiers. During the 2 days it took the steamer to travel down the Atlantic coast and into Chesapeake Bay, the men were kept below decks. Along with them, Charley Quinn saw nothing but dirty, disheveled Union soldiers and heard men cursing their luck in gambling or snoring in heavy sleep in the poisonous air. When not sleeping himself, Charley sat beside Jem, sharing his biscuits, cooked beef, and cheese rations, but eating little so as not to anger the men. He talked more to the printer, asking him questions. He learned that many of the men were what Jem called bounty jumpers. Men who had gone to enlistment offices in any number of towns and received cash bounties, then run off with the money to enlist somewhere else for more money. Weary of such practices, the army now sent new troops to their destinations under guard, so the men could not run off. If they tried to, they were shot at once. Charley mourned Con, and all that time Sullivan had not come near him. Johnny's friend had slept for 24 hours, then gambled constantly the rest of the time. He never came back to Charley to get his jacket either, which Charley now wore for warmth in the sea dampness. It was as if Con had forgotten him and the jacket as well. By now the word was about below decks that their destination was a town called Alexandria, a seaport in part of the state of Virginia that the Union Army had gained some time past. Charley had come to the south all right, but what lay ahead for him here? The boy wondered anxiously what was to become of him, now that every hour of sailing took him ever farther from the Bowery. What would happen when he had to leave the steamer? He'd surely be spotted for what he was. Needing some kind of answer, Charley asked Jem what he thought the army might do with him. Jem's thoughtful reply chilled him to the heart. Maybe some officer will take you on as a servant, his striker, to help him pull his boots on and off. They won't take you as a soldier unless you be 16. A servant? Charley cursed Con Sullivan under his breath. Mother Mary, no, never a servant. How could he avenge Johnny as a servant? Let's see where it goes. Chapter 3 coming next. The Major at the Wharf.